Okay, how's that?
Yes.
Yes.
Good.
I guess it is. Now, last week I said hi to all of you. I'm going to say hi again. Say hi back, please. And I made a pitch for people to join the committee that makes this event possible. And a young fellow, and I don't know who it was, came up afterwards, and I told him I had these, these two clipboards here, and darn it, I couldn't find the clipboards. So he said, we'll put it off for next week. So if you are here, I will see you afterwards, and I have the clipboards. So we do need help. We need help in many different areas. One obviously is setting up this facility and then breaking it down, or striking it, as I was told, is the theater's word for undoing what you did. Strike.
You set up and you strike.
Or
You set up and you strike.
set up a new strike. Okay. So you got to do both. That's one real need, and you can see it right here. The other needs are getting speakers, and then making these lovely things, name tags, making sure everybody here is paid, which I'm pretty sure this group would not have a problem with that. Anyway, I'm going to get off now, so come see me afterwards if you're interested in joining the group. In the meantime, Leon will be introducing our speaker. You're on.
So as John said, I'm Leon Berthium, and I'm part of the OLLI program committee. So again, as John said, we're certainly looking for other volunteers to be part of that program. But it's, again, my pleasure to also welcome you back to our OLLI Spring Lecture Series. And our speaker today is Charlie Hancock, right over here, who will be talking with us about the forests we share, the challenges, change, and stewardship in Northwestern Vermont. As many of us know, forests are a defining part of our landscape here in Vermont, and Charlie's work focuses on helping communities and landowners care for these forests in a time of environmental and economic change. Charlie currently serves as the Franklin and Grand Isle County Forester with the Vermont Department of Forest, Parks, and Recreation. Before that, he spent nearly 20 years as a consulting forester with Northwoods Forestry, working with landowners and conservation groups across northern Vermont. He studied forestry and recreation management at the University of Vermont, and also has worked as an operations forester in the Adirondacks. Beyond his professional work, Charlie has been deeply involved in conservation and community leadership. He co-founded the Cold Hollow to Canada Conservation Partnership and has chaired the Montgomery Select Board since 2016 and has served in various leadership roles. We're very fortunate to have someone like Charlie in our community, that his experience and his perspective will be beneficial to us today. So please join me in welcoming Charlie.
Great, thank you so much. Thank you for the opportunity to be here today. So again, my name is Charlie Hancock. I'm the Franklin Grand Isle County Forester. County Foresters, a lot of our work has to do with the current use program that Vermont has for forest landowners, but in general, we're a public resource for any Vermonter who has any questions about trees or forests. So whether you live in the city and you have a tree in your front yard you have a question on, or you live in the eastern part of the county and you've got 1,000 acres, we're here to help. So please, if you have questions, if you want to go for a walk in the woods, if you want to look at a tree, give me a call. It's what we're here for. So I'm really excited about today. Any chance that I can talk about trees is a good opportunity. And I got to say, it's really great to be doing it in a place that's named after a tree, hardack, right? It's one of the most common trees that we've got out in our woods. It's also the tree that'll probably dull your chainsaw fastest if you're going to be cutting it. So thank you so much. When Leon first reached out about offering a presentation on our forests, I got really excited and my mind went in a million directions because there's simply so much that we could discuss, but we only have an hour. So we're going to cover a lot of ground today, but don't be overwhelmed. I'm really hoping that today is just the start of a broader conversation we can have together as members of the community who call these forests home. So I'd like to start by looking backwards, as the story of our forests is really a story of landscape recovery. Today, Vermont is the 4th most forested state in the United States, behind Maine, New Hampshire, and West Virginia, with about 80% of our land area covered by trees. However, this was not always the case. Many of you have probably heard some iteration of this story before, but between 1790 and 1850, Vermont transformed from a heavily forested area to one where 70 to 80% of our land was cleared for agriculture, peaking between 1850 and 1870. Fun fact, in 1840, at the height of the Merino sheep boom, there were 6 sheep for every 1 person in the state. Today, there are between 5 to 6 Vermonters for every 1 cow. These stone walls that we see in the picture here, crisscrossing our forests, stand as an enduring testament to that history. Westward expansion began following the Civil War, and by 1870, approximately 1/3 of Vermont residents had moved out of the state, looking for those greener pastures and those sweeter soils out west. By the late 1800s, logging had overtaken agriculture as Vermont's main industry. Burlington was considered the 3rd largest lumber port in the country at that time. Now, there's a foundation which sits in Montgomery Center, where I live, tucked in a pasture across the Trout River from Main Street, in the shadow of an old silo and behind what is now Grandpa Grunt's Lodge. You might notice it, you might not notice it in passing along the adjacent vast trail for the growth that obscures the concrete work. But the footprint of the community's past is still readily visible for those who take a moment to consider it. The modest remains mark the site of the former Nelson and Hall's company Atlas Plywood Mill, once one of the largest employers in the area, operating additional mills in Richford and North Troy. In 1921, the company developed an innovative 3-ply veneer packing crate, and for almost 2 decades, if you purchased a Victrola record player or a talking machine, it would be shipped to you anywhere in the world in a crate stamped Atlas Packing Case, Montgomery Center, Vermont. Like so many of Vermont's rural communities, from the end of the Civil War through the 1940s, the timber industry was an integral part of Montgomery's economy. In the 1890s, there were 16 mills producing wood products in the community. Aside from the Atlas packing crates, Montgomery was also known for its production of spruce butter tubs, seen in the ad here up to the left. These allowed for transport of butter from dairies across Franklin County to southern New England, including metropolitan centers like Boston and New York. At their height, million butter tubs each year. So demand for talking machines and Montgomery's Atlas Mill's main client ended with the expansion of radio in the Great Depression, and changes in shipping methods undercut Atlas's competitive advantage. And while Atlas continued to produce plywood for other applications, it closed its Montgomery operation in the 1950s. Changes associated with commodity markets and advances in storage and transportation eventually negated the need for the butter tub. And other market shifts in the production of textiles meant that the bobbins that were produced on Black Falls were also no longer needed. Time passed, and today all that remains are the foundations of these mills, most being gradually overtaken by the forests which once supported their existence. So the forests of Vermont have evolved with nature's disturbance, fire, blowdowns, beavers, for hundreds of thousands of years. But they are just beginning to adjust from the recent human alterations in the form of vast land clearing agricultural activity, extractive logging, and introduced exotic pests and pathogens. In terms of ecological health, we have little to fear from natural disturbance. Blowdowns, for example, even the devastating 1938 hurricane, which decimated forests across New England, a picture from which is shown here. These mix forest soils by uprooting trees and make nutrients available, they prepare a rich seed bed, and they diversify structure and habitat. However, it's less clear how the broad-scale human-induced disturbances from the past few centuries will eventually affect our woodlands, since they are, ecologically speaking, in the broad sense of forest time, new regimes which our forests have yet to evolve with. And this is where we find ourselves today. I do want to, if you can see the picture, I apologize, some of this is small, but Keep that picture in mind of what the residual forest structure looks like following a natural disturbance event, like the 1938 hurricane. Those residual standing trees, standing dead trees, lots of wood on the ground. We'll get back to that in a little bit. Whoops, I'm jumping ahead too quickly. So since the heyday of Vermont's mill towns, our relationship with our forests have changed, but our commitment to them and their importance in our lives has really remained. Our forests define the place we call home, quite literally providing the backdrop to our daily lives and a foundational element to our rural character and economy. How we manage or steward our forests in the face of these new change regimes, especially the impacts of the changing climate, is also vastly different. The takeaway message here is that our forests are dynamic and are still in a state of recovery and change, both physically, the composition and condition of our forests, as well as the forces acting on them, and also the how and how we manage them. We'll get into the how in a minute, but first, let's focus a little more on the what, and we're going to zoom out a little bit, or a lot, as we consider the context within which we find our forested home. So, apologies that the map is a little small or washed out, but we sit here in Vermont within this northern Appalachian Acadian Wabanaki ecoregion. This is that green area on the map that you can see. This area encompasses nearly 83 million acres of eastern North America on either side of the US-Canadian border, stretching from New York to Nova Scotia. This includes all or portions of northern New York, Vermont, New Hampshire, Maine, western Massachusetts, and the provinces of southern Quebec, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, and Prince Edward Island. This diverse ecoregion, referred to as the Northern Forest in the US, is regarded as the last, most intact broadleaf temperate forest remaining anywhere in the world, representing an important transition zone and ecological corridor between the boreal forests of the north and the temperate forests of the south. This area is home to an estimated 3,844 species of plants and animals, including 148 species only found here in this region. It is also home to over 5 million people. No other place in the world do so many people live in such close proximity to so much forest land. We think about the Amazon rainforest or Siberian forests up in northern Russia. Certainly they're big, but they don't have the people and communities embedded within them like we do. It is a forest of global significance that is vital for sustaining life and maintaining climate resilience. Within this vast forested ecoregion are geographically defined areas critical for maintaining an ecologically connected landscape, known as key wildlife linkages. These are the arrows that you can kind of see on the map there. If the relatively intact forests within these linkage areas are degraded or lost, the entire surrounding landscape is diminished. The Staying Connected Initiative, which is an umbrella group for partners and collaborators working in this space, currently defines 11 such linkages within and around the northern forest. The western portion of Franklin County, Franklin County in general, where we sit today, straddling the spine of the Cold Hollow Mountains and the Green Mountains in northern Vermont, is one of these key linkage areas, which connects the northern Green Mountains in Vermont with the Sutton Range in Quebec. This places us at a crucial nexus for ecological connectivity and wildlife movement within this entire northern forest, providing significant core and connecting habitat for wide-ranging mammals like moose, deer, black bear, bobcat, lynx, and fisher. The functional integrity of the entire northern forest can be maintained by conserving forest blocks and connectivity within these linkage areas, one of which we sit in. Given this, the decisions that we make here on this landscape that we share have an impact far greater than our own here in this corner of Vermont. When we zoom in, we see these same principles of connectivity playing out on the Vermont scale. Large blocks of unfragmented forest connected by islands and functional pathways, which allow animals and plant species to move across our landscape. Just as maintaining these linkages within the broader northern forest is critical to maintaining ecological health at the continental scale, maintaining these more local forest pathways ensures ecological health on the Vermont scale. This photo that we're seeing up here is an example of the Schuettsville Hill Wildlife Corridor in Stowe. It's one that gets a fair amount of attention and a lot of work is happening in that space. It's also an area that maybe everyone here has driven through, that corridor of Route 100 between Waterbury and Stowe. And as you can see, you've got two big blocks of forest, the Mount Mansfield State Forest and the C.C. Putnam State Forest. Between those are still these functional linkages of intact forest that allow for wildlife movement between them. So this is one of those examples of linkages on the Vermont scale that we want to protect. These exist across Vermont. So let's keep looking at Vermont's forests. Who owns Vermont's forest? So this data here is a few years old, but still relatively accurate, and it shows that families and individuals own 69% of Vermont's forests. Other private ownerships account for about 10% of ownerships of Vermont's forests. Oftentimes we think about the Green Mountain National Forest and state lands as encompassing so much of our forested landscape, but in reality, almost 80% of our forests is owned by private landowners. And I point that out because it highlights the importance of stewardship on our private lands in maintaining the health and ecological function of our forests here. Why do people own forest land? So this might be a little difficult to see, but the top reason here that people have given in surveys, over 80%, is to enjoy the beauty and the scenery. Coming after that is the importance of wildlife habitat or protection of biodiversity, for privacy, recreation, and hunting. It's not until you get pretty far down the list that you see timber products showing up. That kind of extractive forestry that we traditionally or historically practiced here. And so I point this out because it's a really interesting lens into the motivations for owning forests and managing forests, and contrasting this, where that extractive timber products is so far down the list, with what we were doing back in the 1800s and early 1900s. So we spoke about the importance of ecological health, but the health and integrity of our forests is also critical for the well-being of people and their livelihoods, with the forest-based economy generating an estimated $33 billion per year in the US states that encompass our portion of the northern forest. Here in Vermont, where forests define our cultural heritage and act as an economic engine, the wood products sector supplies an estimated $2.1 billion in annual revenue and supports nearly 14,000 jobs. The forest-based recreation economy adds another $1.9 billion and another 10,000 jobs. And critically important here in Franklin County, the maple sugar industry combines to supply another $95 million in revenue and over 4,000 jobs. If I can advance the slide. There we go. When we consider the contributions of our forests, we'd be remiss if we didn't briefly touch upon forest carbon, because carbon in our forests is getting a lot of attention these days. So I really like this stat. This is a little old, from 2022, but in 2022, the forest sector in Vermont compensated for 67% of Vermont's statewide greenhouse gas emissions. So forests are very important in capturing those greenhouse gases and mitigating climate change. This image to the right, which is a little washed out, shows the above-ground carbon stocking in New England. And now the areas that are in that lighter orange or red color are areas that have higher above-ground carbon stocking. And so if you look through western Massachusetts up through Vermont, that's where you've got some of the highest carbon stocks in New England. Areas up in northern Maine have lower carbon stocks. Those are traditionally associated with the history of more intensive management there. But this just illustrates how important our forests are to this global carbon stock that we're so concerned about. Now, we could spend the rest of our time here talking about carbon. I mean, there's forest or college level courses that are multiple semesters that dig into this. So I don't want to spend a whole lot of time, but I do want to take one moment to connect this idea of forest disturbance and recovery to forest carbon, given the role our forests play in combating climate change. Now, this image on the left that you see, this carbon clock, in the middle of it, it illustrates the age of a forest. So where noon is 0, where 6 p.m. is about 100 years, where 9 p.m. would be about 250 years, the entire clock representing about 400 years of a forest time, because that's how long a lot of our forests can live to, if not longer. Now, as forests grow, they go through different successional stages. Different species come in and grow. Often after a disturbance, species like white pine or gray birch or aspen come in, and they grow very quickly. As forests grow, that composition changes and you get more shade-tolerant species coming in, like sugar maple or beech. And so you can see here that as the clock progresses, we go from more shade-intolerant species to more shade-tolerant species. The composition of our forest is changing. Now, if we go out to that next layer, that green layer, what this is showing is you're seeing carbon sequestration. Sequestration is the drawing down of carbon out of the atmosphere, the pulling it in, the putting it into the bank account. Now, that darker green on the right side of the clock shows high levels of sequestration. Those younger trees are pulling down a lot of carbon. As we go on and the forests get older and those species transition, the rate of sequestration slows down. We're not pulling quite as much carbon out of the atmosphere. Now, if we jump to the outer layer of this clock, that brown layer, that represents carbon storage. Now, you can see in that lighter area, as the forests are young, early on in the clock, we're storing less carbon. The trees are smaller. There's less carbon there on the landscape. As the forests grow and mature, and we get those later successional species moving in, that brown gets darker because we're storing more carbon. I point this out because we need both carbon sequestration and carbon storage. It's not one or the other, it's both. So perhaps the most critical tool in maintaining ecological health in our forests is ensuring that our forests remain as forests, regardless of the successional stage that they're in. Today, Vermont is losing forest cover each year for the first time since the mid-1800s. And you can kind of see the trajectory change on the graph. It's a little hard to see Vermont's line there, but you can see that starting the late 1900s, right around 1990, we started to lose forest land. It started to dip. This is the first time we're seeing this since the mid-1800s, reversing the 150-year trend of forest recovery and expansion since that area of large-scale clearing by European settlers for timber, livestock, and crops. Now, forest loss is caused by increased rates of parcelization and development pressure, with a recent estimate of over 12,000 acres being lost or degraded per year. Given this alarming trend, we are at risk of losing the important contributions forests make to our economy, our ecology, and our culture. However, with only 27% of the land in Vermont protected through permanent conservation, our shared landscape is imperiled by the risk of fragmentation that results from poorly planned development in conjunction with the increasing impacts of climate change that we're going to get into. So given the importance of our forests, their degradation and loss will have profound consequences. Thus, we have a serious responsibility and a narrow opportunity to protect the integrity of this shared landscape that we call home. Increasing the pace of conservation in our forests, as well as increasing the level of stewardship, is vital to maintain the working landscape and the health of our forests at a scale large enough to sustain ecological function in this landscape. Now, the good news is that we have a roadmap to help. Vermont was one of the first states to have a science-based framework called Vermont Conservation Design in place for building a on-the-ground conservation action. This framework provides a map-based prioritization of lands and waters to protect, maintain, and enhance ecological functions and values across the state. Integral to this plan is conserving core interior forest habitat, those large blocks of contiguous forest land buffered from the effects of human development, as well as smaller yet essential blocks that serve as these stepping stones that we saw earlier, stitching this landscape together and allowing plants and animals to move between core forest blocks. So starting at the landscape scale, there are three words that can really help distill what we're after: intact, connected, and diverse. We need our ecological systems to be intact, whether we're talking about large forest blocks or small stepping stones in the landscape. These places need to be connected to one another. We need this larger pattern across the landscape. A pattern of connected forests and waters is important to maintaining biological diversity and as we adapt to climate change. And lastly, we need a diverse array of habitats within this landscape setting. When we talk about the stewardship of our forests, we need to maintain all the pieces that make up this larger whole. So, as we discussed earlier, our forests are facing relatively novel challenges on their path to rebound and recovery. None now so more than the impacts of our changing climate. The impacts of climate change are creating unprecedented stressors and challenges for maintaining the health and integrity of our forests. In response, we need to change how we manage our forests so they are better equipped to remain resilient and viable for the numerous values and services that they provide. This means deploying... We have a notification. This means deploying climate change adaptation and mitigation strategies. These tools help landowners manage forests to withstand and adapt to the effects of climate change, while also protecting the ecological and economic values of the resilient forest. This results in landowners learning and implementing on-the-ground strategies that address the impacts of climate change, including ways to increase carbon capture and storage through improved stewardship practices. So there is strong evidence that Vermont's climate is changing. You can see here on the graph, the blue line there is the average annual temperature in Vermont up to today. The red lines and the yellow lines represent trajectories going forward under different scenarios. The yellow line is the business as usual trajectory, if things continue going like they are today. The red line is under a high emissions scenario. So if we don't start ratcheting down our emissions, that red line shows what the projected temperature increase is going to be. Vermont is becoming warmer. Average annual temperatures are about 2 degrees Fahrenheit warmer since 1900, and Vermont's winters are becoming warmer more quickly. Winter temperatures have warmed at 2.5 times the rate more quickly than average temperatures since 1960. Vermont is also becoming wetter. Average annual precipitation has increased by 21% or 7.5 inches since 1900. However, Vermont still experiences prolonged droughts because of shifts in the water cycle, and different regions of Vermont can experience vastly different climate impacts, even within a given year. The graph to the right is an interesting one. This is a graph showing average leaf out date. And so the red line that you see there is the average leaf out date in Vermont from 1991 to the year 2000. That was happening around the 17th of April or May. I don't know which they're using here. The blue line is the average leaf out date from 2001 to 2010, happening around the 10th. So we're seeing leaf out, trees putting those leaves out happening earlier. Now, if folks recall, about 3 years ago, we had a very late frost. Folks might remember that. At that point, the trees had already leafed out. The oaks at my house had already put off about 12 inches of growth. When that frost hit, it killed all that new growth. And so these early leaf out dates, trees kind of breaking dormancy early, are really a risk to their health, because when they leaf out early and we're still in that freeze-thaw cycle, that new growth can be damaging. It can damage the tree's actual growth structure, it can reduce vigor, and it can reduce health. So these changes are causing key climate impacts on Vermont forests. We see shifting tree species. Northern tree species, which are more cold adapted, such as sugar maple, yellow birch, and white birch, are expected to decline as the climate warms and becomes more suitable for other species, leading to a long-term change in forest composition. And it's not just the trees. Changes in forest composition can influence changes in herbaceous species populations, those things we see on the forest floor and the understory, as well as wildlife species that we see in these forests. You know, this is an example of a sugar maple dominated hardwood forest, and spring beauty is a really pretty spring ephemeral wildflower that we see in our forests there. Red-eyed vireo is a really beautiful songbird that occurs in these forest types. But this is all interdependent. So as these forest types change, we're going to see changes in all the associated plants and animals that utilize them. And these changes are not going to happen overnight. We're not going to wake up tomorrow and all of a sudden sugar maple is going to be gone. But they are going to start to occur within our lifetimes. And we're already kind of seeing that happen. If you were to pull out a range map for northern red oak, I have textbooks that show this from when I was at UVM not that long ago. And according to those range maps, red oak shouldn't be here, but it's here. I mean, the hill behind Montgomery Center up by the Purrier Farm has a ton of oak on it. Those ranges have expanded naturally since those range maps were created. So again, it's not going to happen overnight, but it is happening within our lifetime. We're also seeing an increase in invasive pests and diseases. Warmer winters allow pests like the emerald ash borer, hemlock woolly adelgid, and beech leaf disease to survive and expand, resulting in higher mortality rates. Warmer temperatures also allow for the greater expansion of invasive plant species like buckthorn. Emerald ash borer is one that I think anybody that lives in Franklin County, especially this part of Franklin County, is well aware of. These are having drastic impacts on our forests, really changing whole cloth the composition of some of these natural communities that we depend on. We're also seeing increased hydrological stress. The increased frequency of heavy rains can lead to soil erosion and nutrient leaching, while intermittent or prolonged summer droughts, like what we experienced last summer, can stress shallow-rooted species like sugar maple or even red oak. I recall walking a shallow hill in Fairfax last summer, towards the end of the summer, and the oak trees there had completely defoliated already. And this was in August. We also see increased natural disturbance. While Vermont is not prone to large wildfires, our forests are facing an increasing rate of significant storm events, both in their frequency as well as their intensity. These photos show an example of such an event at the Caddy Hill Municipal Forest in Stowe, which is a really important forest for recreation, as well as other things. And you can see, pretty vast swaths of this forest were completely blown down in a storm event. Kind of reminiscent of what we saw from the 1938 hurricane. Not as widespread, but still pretty important and pretty significant impact in this forest. So these events are increasing. We also see wetter summers and milder winters. It's funny. I should say that wetter summers and milder winters, right? If we look back over the last 6 months, it didn't seem like a mild winter. It's a good ski winter. But if you look at the general trajectory of where we're going with our climate trends, we are seeing wetter summers and generally milder winters. And a reduced snowpack in warmer winters or low snow winters, where you get those thaw events happening multiple times throughout the winter, this can damage tree roots, can also complicate timber harvesting and management activities. Important in Franklin County, these changes can also alter the sugaring season, both in timing and in production. Shallow-rooted trees like sugar maple are highly vulnerable to damage from soil freezing, which occurs more frequently when thin snow cover fails to insulate the ground during extreme cold snaps, making our sugar bushes more vulnerable. Warmer winters also increase heavy icing events, which can damage crowns and reduce vigor. I mean, we've all seen this picture up in the upper left. The 98 ice storm is probably the best example of this, but on an annual basis, we have these events happening in various areas within our forests. Maybe not at the same scale, but happening, and happening more frequently. So when combined, all these factors are poised to result in reduced forest health and resiliency. The combination of stressors, drought, pests, altered precipitation, greater high-intensity disturbance events can lead to increased tree mortality and hinder the forest's ability to recover. So now let's shift and talk about what we can do as forest managers and stewards. This is kind of like that good news portion of the talk. Forest management in the United States has its origins in production. Gifford Pinchot, the first chief of the U.S. Forest Service, was quoted as saying, "Conservation means the wise use of the earth and its resources for the good of man." Wood was a crop, and forestry was essentially tree farming. But beginning in the late 1800s, a new approach to nature-based forestry began to take root in Europe. The seeds of this approach first arrived at the Harvard Forest in Petersham, Massachusetts in 1902, but didn't really begin to grow as a widely understood concept until the 1990s, only reaching its current understanding in the early 2000s with the introduction of ecological forestry as a concept. Ecological forestry is a management approach that applies an understanding of the structure, function, and dynamics of natural forest ecosystems, including old forest characteristics, to achieve integrated environmental, economic, and social outcomes. It's often referred to as new forestry because it presented models of stewardship that stood in stark contrast with the older wood production systems, emphasized by those sustained yield principles. So, two foundational elements to ecological forestry are diversity and resilience. These are words that we've heard multiple times in this talk. Biological diversity. This is the variety of life and all its forms and all interactions and genetic diversity between living things and their environment. It includes ecosystem diversity, landscape diversity, community diversity, species diversity. This is the what, the nuts and bolts, and the how, the processes that are occurring on the landscape. Resilience is the capacity of a forest to withstand or absorb external pressures and return over time to its pre-disturbance state. These are the two principles which inform the various pathways for ecological forestry. Now, three key principles or pathways within ecological forestry are those of resistance, resilience, and transition. These are shown on the diagram here, and I want to point out the color composition of the trees in each pathway to the right, as they demonstrate a deviation from current conditions, both in a managed and unmanaged or passively managed system. As you can see, the species change, as do the acceptable range of management outcomes where they land on that bar to the far right. Each pathway will lead to a different outcome in our forests. Resistance is about what we maintain. It's about playing defense for those nuts and bolts. This pathway is about sustaining ecological function as a means of reducing the impacts of stressors and reducing the risks to long-term impacts of severe disturbances. This pathway is associated with maintaining species diversity, keeping all those parts in our forests, as well as structural diversity in our forests, how those parts occur within a stand or across the landscape. This includes the retention of dead wood, standing or on the forest floor, as well as maintaining biological legacies, these trees that will live out their lifespans within our forests. In practicing resistance, we're sustaining what we have. Now, resilience, this is something we build in our forests to accommodate change. This is about not just maintaining, but enhancing species diversity and structural diversity. It involves promoting landscape connectivity to maintain and enhance genetic diversity. In practicing resilience, we're accommodating some level of change towards a future adapted state. Now, transition, this is an intentional change that we facilitate, making community adjustments through species transitions, often with an eye towards realignment of our forested systems following a severe disturbance, whether it's a stochastic event like a big blowdown, or a hurricane, or species loss like we're seeing with emerald ash borer, or potentially beech leaf disease. In practicing transition, we are intentionally facilitating and directing change within our forests. So, this is pretty heady stuff. Let's see what it looks like actually applied on the landscape with some examples of practices that people are doing in their woods today. So one example of a common practice of ecological forestry is something called crop tree release, coupled with these principles of retention. This combines both the resistance and the resilience pathways. I do want to point out the tension between the name crop tree release and the history of forestry as resource extraction and the evolution of ecological forestry. Sometimes our lexicon is slow to catch up. But this practice in its form is directed at enhancing vigor and resilience in those trees that we're managing for. This is something that many forest landowners here in Franklin County, especially in our sugar bushes, are already practicing. This practice is directed at enhancing vigor and resilience in those trees that we're managing for. So for example, in a sugar bush, sugar maple. By increasing resources available to the best trees, this will increase their resilience to stressors, like drought and defoliation. And this is through this process. This diagram up here is a little hard to see, it's a little washed out, but it's going through and opening up those crop trees on multiple sides to allow for crown expansion, to allow for vigor. But we also look to increase the resilience of the forest itself by maintaining species diversity through all canopy layers. So you can kind of see, not that well in some of these pictures, that this practice will lead to greater diversity in the layers within our forest. A lot of our forests we walk through have kind of homogeneity in their structure, right? They're all one age class. They're 40, 50 years old, the trees came in, they grew up together. There's no understory, there's no midstory, there's only an overstory. Looks pretty, you can see pretty far, but without that diversity of structure, you're lacking pretty significant habitats. One example of that would be for black-throated blue warbler. Black-throated blue warbler nests at about this level in the forest. If your forest doesn't have that level of vegetation, you're not going to have black-throated blue warbler nesting there. So not only is a practice like this looking at opening up those trees to increase vigor and growth and increase forest health, it's looking at creating that more complex structure so we can have that diversity of habitats. These forests are also more resilient to those storm events. If you have a forest with no understory and you get a high wind event and it blows that canopy down, nothing is there to take over and grow back. It's very susceptible to invasive species coming in because it's a great open environment. Now, if you have an established understory and midstory and that canopy comes down, those trees are there and they're ready to take off. Another important element here is maintaining deadwood in the forest. Now, remember that picture of that hurricane? Lots of standing dead trees, lots of wood on the ground. And so ecological forestry is based on using those principles, but through active management. And so one of the principles within this practice is maintaining or recruiting dead wood or maintaining standing dead trees. These same elements that we see within the natural forest systems that occur out here. Oftentimes, this practice is not extractive at all. Folks are going out and they're cutting and dropping trees and leaving them where they're felled. They're girdling trees and leaving them standing. So again, this is about forest health and composition and diversity. It's not necessarily about what we pull out of the woods. Another example of a practice which is gaining more ground is enrichment planting. This can combine both the resilience and transition pathways. Whereas most of our planting efforts, which took place in the early to mid-1900s, resulting in the plantations of white pine or red pine or Norway spruce or even Scotch pine that we see on the landscape today, whereas those were directed at soil conservation efforts, enrichment planting involves supplementing or introducing specific species and genotypes as a hedge against future change. So this diagram shows 3 different kinds of enrichment planting and facilitated species movement within this practice. This one on the left, population expansion, is a way of building resilience by adding more species where they already occur. So this would be taking a species that we already see in a forest setting and planting more of it because it's an important species for wildlife or for some of the uses that we want. Another practice that we see with enrichment planting is range expansion. So this would be adding species outside of where they occur, but where they could presumably move over time. And so we might not have red oak in some stands in Montgomery, but we've got it in Montgomery. We've got it in some of those connected forests. So this would be planting red oak in some of those hardwood stands that are adjacent to where you find it. Now, I want to point out that time is an important factor here because from an evolutionary perspective, range expansion might occur naturally. Like I said, the range maps for red oak that I have in my textbooks don't show red oak in Montgomery, but it's there, it's moved there. So trees can move, they can expand their ranges naturally. But what we're doing here is we're accelerating that because the changes that we're seeing acting on our landscape are accelerating at a time frame which is much more quick than forest's ability to naturally evolve to those changes. So we're kind of giving it a boost. We're kind of accelerating this practice and this process. The last one here, whoops, we're going backwards. Oh no, we're going forwards. Okay. The last one here is species migration. So this is one where you're adding species where natural migration might not occur because of some natural feature, a mountain range, something like that. But we're doing this because these southern adapted species might be the ones that are going to be here to survive and move forward in the future. This is really important because there is a projected loss of some species from our forest. We talked about emerald ash borer and ash. Another one is beech. So beech bark disease has been in our forests for a long time. Probably seen it, creates a pockmarked appearance on beech trees. We now have a new pest on the landscape, beech leaf disease, which is a small microscopic worm, a nematode, which gets into the buds of the beech trees, and as the leaves unfurl, it eats the cellular structure between the venations of the leaves, which reduce the leaves' ability to photosynthesize. This is killing beech in forests south of New England. It's now here. Right now it's in Jericho. It hasn't moved much further north than that, but we expect it to be here in Franklin County within the next year or two. When you couple beech leaf disease with beech bark disease, we're looking at the potential loss of beech on our landscape. Beech is a critically important species for wildlife. Think about black bear. And so when we think about losing beech, we think about the importance for wildlife to introduce other mast-bearing species in our forests. That could be oak, which might be happening or occurring here already, might be hickories, which are happening, say, in the western portion of Franklin County, but not the eastern portion. It might be moving southern oak species up, which can supplement that source of mast. So these are the tools that we're using to kind of mitigate the loss within our forests. Now, I will say that some of this does come with risk, right? How many times in our history have we had really smart people say, we'll just bring this in to take care of it, right? So we need to be careful with this, especially with this assisted species migration, bringing species which might not naturally move here, but they might actually help. So thinking about species and also genotype. If we're planting red oak, which is growing in, say, South Carolina, as opposed to red oak growing in Pennsylvania, the red oak in Pennsylvania is going to be more adapted to the climate of Vermont than the red oak in southern South Carolina, thinking about where it naturally occurs. And so even the genotypes of specific species and where we move them from is critically important. So ecological reserves are also a really important part of ecological forestry. Passive management is a management choice within our portfolio. These areas at multiple scales are critically important as unique habitats given that some plant species and animal species are only found here. They also play a critical role in carbon storage and mitigating hydrological flux on our landscape. They also provide a benchmark against which we can measure our activities elsewhere on the landscape. An example here in Franklin County of a large ecological reserve is the newly created Bear's Nest Wilderness Area in Richford, which encompasses almost 2,000 acres. This project was part of a larger conservation project which protected 4,700 acres, which encompasses both passive and actively managed forests, which are now part of a network of nearly 10,000 acres of unfragmented forests which extend from Vermont into Quebec. So the practices of ecological forestry are reflective of managing forests using climate change adaptation strategies. As we discussed, this includes managing for a diversity of plant and animal species by increasing structural diversity and the complexity of our forests. This is also done by promoting a variety of tree species with different age classes and size classes, retaining snags and down wood material, which is important for wildlife habitat and soil health, while simultaneously growing larger and longer-lived trees. This keeps the forests connected and healthy, capturing and storing carbon, and better positioned to adapt and remain resilient to the impacts of climate change. Implementing these strategies can also result in a higher volume of forest products and create opportunities for introduced carbon as a monetized product. What's really exciting about all this is that much of this work happening in this space is occurring not only in New England, but right here in Vermont. These guides, which you probably can't see from where you're sitting, are written in partnership with folks right here at UVM. So I think we should be proud of the work happening in our state to advance the practice of forestry as we think about these threats and challenges that come before us. So in the interest of time, I'm gonna just skip through this next little piece real quickly because I do want to answer questions. And we're gonna end with this. So the takeaway message of all of this is that our forests are dynamic and they're always changing. They're in a state of recovery and response, both to historic actions, as well as to the relatively new threats and challenges posed by climate change. In light of this, how we steward them has evolved and is continuing to evolve. With 80% of Vermont's forests in private ownership, it will fall on all Vermonters to steward this shared landscape to ensure health and resilience going forward, both ecological health, but also the health of the communities that depend on them. Our place here within this vast expanse of forest is as members of a community that not only includes the people, but the soils, the waters, the plants, and the animals, or as Aldo Leopold put it collectively, the land. And as members of this community, we have a responsibility to protect it. Protecting large, unfragmented, intact forest blocks within the region and the connectivity between them not only protects wildlife habitat, protects the working landscape and the forest products economy, the tourism economy, traditional values such as hunting and fishing, access to forested areas for snowmobiling, hiking, and other recreation, clean air and water, scenic beauty, and small rural communities. Put simply, protecting these forests protects that which defines the place that we call home. And when we zoom out, we see that our work at the local level really builds and maintains connectivity and forest health and community health on the continental level. So thank you very much. I'll end there and we'll have time for questions. Yes.
Was the American chestnut ever a part of Vermont's forests?
Yes, we did have American chestnut here. I don't know if the range extended all the way up into northern Vermont, but chestnut was part of our forests. And the American Chestnut Foundation has found what they believe to be healthy native chestnut. And that's some of the work they're doing with crossing and trying to get blight-resistant chestnut to introduce back into our forests. That's another example of enrichment planting, finding those genotypes that are resistant to the blight and introducing them back into our forests so that they can become another part of that community. Yeah. Yes?
The old growth forest is down in Dummerston, I believe. Is it accessible?
So I'm not sure about old growth forests that are in Dummerston, but we certainly have multiple examples of old growth forests across Vermont. Dummerston, there's some in Proctor. There's even examples up in this area. Cambridge Pines is a really interesting example of what would be considered an old growth forest. And we have really interesting small examples of what can be considered old growth forest. There's an area on Black Falls Brook in Montgomery, which is a really good example of an old growth hardwood forest. You've got trees in there that are pushing 400 years old. It's down in a very steep area along the brook. You know, oddly enough, the areas that we have are areas that were really hard to get to. So we do have these examples of old growth forests around Vermont. I can't think of one that's quite local here that would be easily accessible with public access. But over time, through some of these ecological reserves, we are trying to develop those areas. And certain ones like the Bear's Nest area, which is owned by the New England Wilderness Trust, as well as another area, the Burnt Mountain Tract in Montgomery, owned by TNC. Those are accessible and open to the public. So as more of these grow and develop, there are going to be examples that future generations can enjoy in this area. Yeah. Yes?
I've had someone come and look at my ash trees, and it was necessary to cut 7 of them down.
Yep.
Because of the ash borer. So if you have ash on your property, you might want to have somebody look at it.
Yes, so emerald ash borer is rapidly moving through the county. We're really seeing the impacts in this part of the county now because it's been here for a number of years. There are ash on our landscape that we think are resistant. We are finding lingering ash in the forests after this insect has moved through, but for the most part, the ash is susceptible and it's going to get hit. The first signs you're going to see are kind of blonding on the trunk. Often you see bird peck on the tree. That's a sure sign emerald ash borer is in there. Now, to removal, it's often easier and cheaper to remove a live tree than a dead tree. So unfortunately, thinking about removal, especially where they're in a hazard area, is something to think about. There is an injection that you can do to healthy ash that makes them resistant to emerald ash borer, but it's relatively expensive and it has to be done when the tree is still healthy. These injections can cost, at least a couple $100 for an individual tree, and you got to do them every other year. So it's really limited to those special yard trees or in research plots out in the woods. So there are options, but they're not ones that we can apply at a broad scale. Do you have a question?
I'm just going to ask, if you do, you're saying most of our forests are privately owned. Does the state or do you people go in and help them with theirs, or is it a cost to us? Or?
Yes, so fantastic question. So the private lands program, which is what the county foresters are under within the Department of Forest Parks and Recreation, is here to assist private landowners. And so, like I said earlier, anybody who has questions about either a tree in their front yard or a question about their forest, we're from the government and we're here to help. So by all means, that's the best part of my job is getting out in the woods with people to talk about what's going on in their woods, what the opportunities are, what their objectives are, and how we can help folks meet them. A lot of this is through the current use program most folks here are familiar with in some degree or another, but you don't have to be in current use to access a county forester. So if you've got questions, if you want to go for a walk in the woods, give me a call. Yes, in the back.
Human activity with trees is evident along country roads where it's got maples that are just planted. People did that. and they seem to be all about the same age, old trees. What was, before government programs got involved, how did that happen?
Yeah, so we have old trees on our landscape. They occur in our woods in those forested settings. Oftentimes you walk through the woods, it's a very young forest, but you come across this 4-foot diameter sprawling sugar maple, right? These are remnant trees that were left or planted after agricultural clearing. A lot of these were old trees that were tapped in old pastures. We also have trees lining our roads. Some of these were trees that were retained as they grew. Other ones were planted. So the main slug of planting in our area really came through in that early to mid 1900s through efforts like the Soil Conservation Corps. Those, as you point out, are mostly the plantations that we see. Oftentimes, the big old hardwoods, those big legacy oaks or sugar maples, are ones that were retained within a forested setting. Oftentimes, it might have been an area that was cut initially through settlement, then allowed to regrow, and maybe cut again, at which point it might not have been entirely cut. Some of those maples were left for shade, and they grew up in that open setting, which is why they have those big sprawling crowns. So we do see trees on our landscape. Some that were planted and some that did happen naturally that are still retained out there. Yes?
How big a threat are the invasive species like buckthorn and others, and how do you mitigate that?
Yeah, so invasive species are a huge threat. Up here, the typical ones we see in our woods are buckthorn, honeysuckle, barberry, multiflora rose. And they can grow in a density where they limit the ability of the forest to regenerate naturally. So that forest cannot seed in new progeny of species that should occur there. What you end up with is an understory of nothing but invasives. And invasives, certainly they grow and they're a vegetative structure on the soil, so it holds it in place maybe, but they have very little value from a wildlife perspective. And again, they limit the ability of native species to regenerate. And so when you get really high populations in our woods, as disturbance happens or cutting happens, we're not going to see that next generation of sugar maple or oak or any other species come up. It's going to be just that savanna of invasives. And that's why we're trying to do a lot of work to combat them using multiple practices. There's also funding available through different entities to help with this in our forests. But I would say that, invasive species are right there in the top 3 threats to our forests. Yes?
Often struck with the impact of the deer in the woods. It seems like a lot of woods we hike in, we're losing an entire generation.
Yeah.
And I know it's worse south of here, because that's where their overpopulation is first. Are they looking at what the long-term impacts are?
Yeah, so deer browse is a significant impact on the health of our forests, because as you point out, they tend to eat little trees. They also tend to eat little trees that we want to grow. It's funny, you walk in some stands where there's no sugar maple or oak, but there's a lot of beech, right? They don't like to eat beech. If we could train them to eat beech, a lot of more foresters would be happy. It's interesting, you get in a room with a bunch of wildlife biologists from Fish and Wildlife and a bunch of foresters, and there's certainly disagreements about what this idea of carrying capacity is. Carrying capacity would be, in one context, what is that population of deer that can maintain a stable population? That's when a forester stands up and says, yeah, but if that stable population is destroying all of our new growth, it's not sustainable for the forest itself. So it's a balance. A lot of deer management is also, I'll say, political. But it is a big deal. And so, what we try to look at is opportunities for population management. You can certainly post your land in Vermont. Other examples of things you can do are hunter safety zones. So you could certainly kind of exclude hunting from a certain area of a property, but allow hunting in other areas. Another thing that we started to use are certain harvesting techniques that we've seen that have kind of worked. Traditionally, you cut the wood, you got the wood out of the woods, you did something with it, you used it. Traditionally, we also felled trees and we cut those tops way down low. One was this idea of fire danger, another one was just they looked bad, right? One of the practices we're using now, when we cut a big hardwood tree, it drops, that crown is big, it's messy, multiple crowns might come down together. We might cut, the logs out, cut some firewood out. We might leave that crown in the woods, unlopped in a messy environment. Nature's messy, right? When trees fall down in the woods on their own, no one's there to buck them up and clean them. So when we do this, when we drop trees and we leave those crowns tops big and messy, what we have found is that deer are less likely to eat trees that will grow and establish within those crowns where they have that filtered sunlight. They're less likely to jump into that mess because they can't get out of there very quickly. So there are some techniques that we can use in terms of cutting and what we do to help protect regeneration. In other instances where we're doing some of this enrichment planting, we're actually going out and tubing these trees in a forested setting, which seems kind of crazy, but it's the only way to get them to establish and grow up above browse height and to survive. Yes, Richard.
Charlie, I've heard from sugar makers over the years that Franklin County produces about 1/3 of Vermont's maple production, with Vermont producing about half of the country's. If that's the case, Franklin County is producing maybe 15% of the country's maple syrup. Is that reasonably accurate?
Yeah, I don't have the most recent stats at my fingertips, and I don't have them up here either. But what you're describing is generally accurate. Franklin County is what's it called, the land of milk and maple, right? We joke sometimes that, you know, Franklin County, no tree left untapped. It is. It's a big part of our rural community and our rural economy up here, and we are putting out an incredibly high percentage of the production in our forests right here, and it's something to be proud of. You know, I think one of the interesting things about forest management and keeping forests as forests is we want to make sure that owning forest land is economically viable, right? You got to pay taxes on it. There's carrying costs. So the economic viability of owning and managing forest land is really important. Economic viability can be something in terms of, you know, harvesting timber and wood products, but tapping is also something that provides economic viability. So having that kind of income coming off of the land to support forests staying as forests and support our rural economies and rural communities is really critically important. And certainly maple sugaring is part of our identity here in Franklin County.
One more question for Charlie?
Yes.
Great talk, just fascinating, lots and lots of detailed information. Is there a way to access it later? Because I don't feel like I'm retaining a lot of it. Do you have a QR code or a website or something?
Yeah, so we can certainly make the slide deck available. That might be the best place to start. You know, a lot of the topics we covered today, there's like college courses that drill into a lot of the stuff. We covered a lot of ground. So there's no one-stop shop really for all of this. It's kind of a lot together all at once happening all the time around us. So what I would say is we can make the slide deck available to folks who want to look through it. And then again, I'm hoping this is the start of a conversation. And so if you have questions, if you want to learn more, give me a call, shoot me an email, and let's go for a walk in the woods together.
What is your contact?
I'll make sure Richard has it to give out to folks.